Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to Critical Weight Theory. So, throughout history, people have often been told that hierarchy is inevitable. We're told that society requires bosses, rulers, governments, and economic elites to function. We're told that competition, inequality, and domination are simply part of human nature. Yet, generation after generation, movements have emerged to challenge that assumption. These movements envision something radically different at times, a society in which the means of production were collectively owned, where hierarchical structures were dismantled, and where human labor served human needs more than profit margins. Rather than organizing society around wealth accumulation, they imagined communities built around cooperation, mutual aid, and democratic participation. Their goal was not merely political reform, but a transformation of social relationships themselves. And history provides numerous examples of people attempting to put these ideas into practice. And though they often fall short or receive a lot of criticism, it's important to actually look at them and, take some of the good with the bad. And one of the earliest and most influential examples was the Paris Commune of 1871. Following France's defeat in the Franco Prussian War and the collapse of the French Empire, working class Parisians took control of their city. For roughly 2 months, they experimented with forms of self government that challenged traditional state authority. The Commune introduced labor reforms, promoted workers' management of abandoned factories, and sought to separate church and state. Though short lived, it left a lasting impression on radicals throughout the world. Its destruction was swift and brutal. During what became known as the Bloody Week, thousands of communards were killed as government forces retook the city. But the idea survived, and decades later, during the Spanish Revolution of 1936, millions of people participated in one of history's largest experiments in worker self management. In regions such as Catalonia and Aragon, factories, farms, transportation networks, and public services were collectivized. Workers organized through councils, syndicates, and local assemblies. Decisions were often made through direct participation rather than through distant political authorities. While conditions varied from place to place, the revolution demonstrated that large scale industries and services could be operated without traditional capitalist ownership. And the Spanish experiment, however, faced enormous obstacles. It confronted not only fascist military forces, but also internal political conflicts. And ultimately, the victory of General Franco's forces brought the revolution to an end. And it must be noted that they also clashed significantly with the state communist uh, elements in the world at the time. So, other examples appeared throughout the 20th century. Workers' councils emerged in Germany following World War I. Similar council movements developed in Hungary during the 1956 uprising. In the early years following the Russian Revolution, Soviets or councils represented grassroots forms of worker and community organization before power became increasingly centralized in the state bureaucracy. And these experiences differed significantly from one another. Some lasted weeks, others lasted for years. None created a permanent stateless society or anything that history books tend to talk about all that much, yet they revealed something important. Alternative forms of social organization were not simply utopian fantasies. People repeatedly demonstrated an ability and an interest to coordinate production, distribute resources, and govern their communities through institutions that differed dramatically from conventional states and capitalist enterprises. Supporters of these movements often argue that their greatest obstacle was not human nature, but organized power. And I think actually the history pretty thoroughly describes that reality. So, from that perspective, the state functions as an instrument that frequently aligns itself with economic interests, whether through military intervention or violent force, however you want to. Military intervention is sort of like a PC way of saying you crush somebody with brutal force, and of course even that would be a PC way of saying you like blew people to bits or torture them or something along those lines. But anyway, another method was legal repression, general surveillance, or political co optation. Governments have often acted to preserve existing systems of ownership and authority, and it's often been a little bit of a brutal undertaking, to say the least. And you could describe this relationship as a state capitalist nexus, a mutually reinforcing partnership between political and economic power. Regardless of one's own political perspective, historical examples show that revolutionary movements have frequently encountered resistance from both state institutions and economic elites, which often function like the hand in the glove. Today, the political landscape looks a little different from that of the 19th or 20th centuries, though probably not as different as some people would think. The Cold War has ended, global capitalism dominates much of the world, neoliberal economic policies have shaped decades of political decision making, yet many of the underlying tensions remain, and that's because the system itself actually creates them. They don't just come out of nowhere. Economic inequality continues to grow in many countries. Well, you might say every country, really. Workers frequently report feelings of alienation and powerlessness, housing affordability, healthcare access, and job insecurity remain persistent concerns. At the same time, the ecological crisis raises questions about whether economic systems built around endless growth can actually coexist with our planetary limits. As some have noted, people across the political spectrum have increasingly questioned the legitimacy of established institutions. You don't necessarily need to be somebody on the far left to sometimes actually uh, question the status quo and authority in general. In fact, there's a reason they have the so called horseshoe theory, because sometimes the same very broad dislike of authority actually can be detected in the right wing as much as in the left wing. The only problem is the right wingers tend to blame it on specific groups. Immigrants. They'll bash immigrants. They'll bash other religions outside of their own. They'll bash other nations, other this, other that. It's one of those things that divides people. That's one of the tactics that I believe and I know is actually being employed. I mean, you can see with your very own eyes the divide and conquer strategy, where you blame all of the flaws of society on this group or that group or what have you. So, many have concluded that the promises made by political and economic elites have not been fulfilled, and this growing dissatisfaction has produced a wide range of responses from populist movements that, again, bash outsiders. You have that on the right, and then you have renewed interest in cooperative and community based alternatives on the left. And around the world, experiments do continue. Worker cooperatives allow employees to collectively own and manage businesses. Like I've got a co op where I live, for example, and I sometimes shop there. Now, I don't know exactly if you could say it's a revolutionary thing, but it's maybe a step in the right direction. And in my view, I think society should look sort of like a large cooperative full of smaller cooperatives. And community assemblies give residents a direct voice in local decisions sometimes. Indigenous autonomy movements challenge conventional models of governance and development. So, one frequently cited example is the Zapatista movement in Chiapas, Mexico. Since 1994, indigenous communities associated with the movement developed autonomous institutions emphasizing local decision making, collective responsibility, and resistance to both state and corporate control. And although you might be able to criticize the Zapatistas or any other movement uh, citing this problem or that, the point is, these efforts exist. They're going to be flawed because the world is flawed and individuals are flawed, but they still serve as a possible example of just what I'm talking about here. These contemporary experiments may not resemble the grand revolutions of the past exactly. They're often smaller, more localized, and less visible, but they reflect a persistent human aspiration, the belief that ordinary people can step up and try to govern themselves, the belief that cooperation can replace domination, the belief that another way of organizing society remains possible and desirable. And whether one agrees with these movements or not, they raise some fundamental questions that remain unresolved. How much hierarchy is actually necessary? Who should control the wealth that society produces? Can freedom be maximized?